One of the delightful secondary gains of my association this year with Christ in St. Luke's has been that I've had the opportunity to recite certain sentences that you may have heard, but never from a rabbi. For instance, on the Sunday evening when we had lessons and carols, and we had been here that morning, and then we were back in the evening, and I saw one of our regular attendees who hadn't been there in the morning, and I said to him, "I missed you in church this morning." I never said that sentence in my life. So in that same vein, it now falls upon me to tell you that April 14th, Palm Sunday, April 21st, Easter Sunday. Right? Did I get that right? Okay. So April 28th and May 5th will be the Sundays of our two encore sessions. And they'll be devoted to wisdom in the rabbinic tradition. Interestingly enough, all the way back early last summer, when Wynn and I shared a couple of preliminary ideas, I offered him 3 lectures. One would be on conventional wisdom, which would have been the book of Proverbs. One was on what I would call unconventional wisdom, which would have been the book of Ecclesiastes. And the third one would have been how the rabbis wrestled Ecclesiastes back into the mold of conventional wisdom. So this goes all the way back to the beginning of our series, but we're going to be looking at 2 different genres of rabbinic work. In one day, we're going to be looking at something called the Ethics of the Fathers, or the Chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. This is the the treatise of ethical teachings, which is a supplement to the Mishnah, the basic rabbinic law code. So ethics in rabbinic legal statements is one day, and ethics in rabbinic Bible commentary will be the other day. And we will look at the rabbinic work of commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. So I hope that you'll enjoy discovering a world that I've been sailing in that world for quite a bit. Now, we turn to our day's discussion. I've thought about what wisdom text that we have not yet studied could I share with you that would help us to frame the conversation of living wisely in the awareness of our mortality. And so I want to share with you Psalm number 90. I've given you 2 separate translations. One is a masterful translation and commentary by Robert Alter. We've seen his work already. And the other one is a translation by a friend and mentor of mine, Rabbi Martin Cohen, who published a very lovely translation of the book of Psalms and meditation upon it, called Our Haven and Our Strength. But let's just look at Alter's translation. A prayer of Moses, man of God. This is the only chapter attributed to Moses outside the 5 books of Moses. So it's interesting to know what theme in the evolving biblical tradition was associated with Moses. And it turns out that the theme was human transience, divine eternity. A prayer of Moses, man of God. O Master, you have been our abode in every generation. Before mountains were born, before you spawned earth and world, from forever to forever, you are God. You bring man back to the dust and say, turn back, humankind. For 1,000 years in your eyes are like yesterday gone, like a watch in the night. You engulf them with sleep. In the morn they are like grass that passes. In the morning it sprouts and passes, by evening it withers and dies. For we are consumed in your wrath, and in your fury we are dismayed. You have set our transgressions before you, our hidden faults in the light of your face. For all our days slip away in your anger. We consume our years like a sigh. The days of our years are but 70 years, and if in great strength 80 years. And their pride is trouble and grief, for swiftly cut down we fly off. Who can know the strength of your wrath, as the fear of you is your anger? To count our days rightly, instruct, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Come back, O Lord, how long? And have pity on your servants. Sate us in the morn with your kindness. Let us sing and rejoice all our days. Give us joy as the days you afflicted us, the years we saw evil. Let your acts be seen by your servants, and your glory by their children. And may the sweetness of the Master our God be upon us, and the work of our hands firmly found for us, and the work of our hands firmly found. A beautiful, elegiac, somber meditation. And it brings together exactly the two themes. The Hebrew limnot yamenu kain hodah, v'navi levav chokhmah. Generally translated, teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. But Alter, very sensitive to the syntax of the Hebrew, says, not teach us to number our days, but he gives us what is actually closer to the original, to count our days rightly, instruct. Make your days count the right way. And that constitutes a heart of wisdom, which might be the 10-second summary of our entire work together. Carrie, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself first, because in the Tractate Sanhedrin it says that the Chief Justice votes last. So I think that as compared to the clergy, you get to vote first.
My name is Carrie White. I'm an English professor at Regent. I've been there for about 11 years, and I don't know,
Carrie.
Speak up.
If you can't hear the speaker, just wave and I'll invite the speaker to come use the microphone instead.
Carrie White.
Do you want to use the microphone?
I'll just scream.
No, okay.
I'm Carrie White. I'm an English professor at Regent University. I've been there for about 11 years. I don't know a whole lot about mortality. I know I will.
Sorry, Carrie. Still need to use the mic.
Oh, okay.
People are signaling. Thank you.
Okay, so anyway, Carrie White, Regent University, 10 years, English professor. I don't know a whole lot about mortality per se, except I do know I will pass away one day. And luckily, Duke University does not know about mortality yet either. The NCAA tournament, we're still in there. I know. And I've also copied some poems for you, maybe 6 poems that talk about death and different reactions to death. I will offer them. So, thanks. Still standing myself?
Yeah, as if we don't know. Or an opening thought that you want for us to frame our conversation.
Oh, okay.
Either way.
Okay. I'm Sue Cromlin, and I'm 80 years old, so I've got the strength of days. And I've lived with mortality, I think, all my life, in the sense that I'll tell you one story that kind of tells how my mother dealt with living with mortality as a young person. And that was, she was married at 18 to a naval officer, had a baby, my big sister, at 19, and at 21, she was widowed. My sister's father went down in a dirigible off the coast of New Jersey in the Akron. And within a year, she got married, a little over a year. But she told me that she felt like, that this was the great love, was her first husband. And it was very romantic, and he died very young, and she was very young. But then, so she married my dad in 1934. During World War II, he was a naval officer also, and he was gone a lot. And I think this happened in the Pacific, but it might have been the North Atlantic, because he was in both campaigns. So one night, my mother had a really bad feeling about my dad, that he was in danger. And she remembered it, and later she got a letter from him, and they worked out that the same day or the same night that she felt this very bad feeling about my dad was that a torpedo had hit his destroyer, but it was a dud. But that changed, the mortality of her husband changed her, and that's when she really fully loved him. And so I grew up with that story about how when we know we may lose somebody, and that we can also perhaps be more free to love them. She was a courageous, fun-loving person, so she was a good Navy wife. Honoring my mother.
I'm Win Lewis, rector of Christ in St. Luke's. About to go into my 10th year as rector, and just celebrated my 38th year of ordination. But I've lived in the shadow of death almost all of my life. I was 4 years old when my father had his first heart attack. He lived till he was 80. But my father, we're all of Welsh descent, and Wales has a lot of big mountains and dark shadows, and my father always lived with the fear of dying suddenly and unprepared. And I think that fear, that anxiety kind of shed its shadow on our family as well. So that was the first arena of being aware fairly young of mortality. And then in 1999, they thought I had a terminal illness, that I had lymphoma. I had mysterious symptoms. It turned out to be a systemic infection, but I was sent to the oncologist, and he put me in the oncology section of Norfolk General. And that was a really enlightening experience, because people really treat you differently when they see oncology up there, and you're in that. And it doesn't matter what you say to the otherwise. So that gave me an experience of times where I wondered if I was going to survive this. And I did, thanks be to God. But it has really made me think a lot about living in the face of mortality.
In a moment or two, I'm going to invite all of us who are here to offer the questions or observations that you would like to be part of the conversation. But I want to share with you a classic rabbinic story, and I'll tell you in advance that the reason I'm sharing this story is to invite you to think about what is the view of the meaning of a life that you're going to glean from the story. One of the great rabbis, Rabbi Meir, lived around the 2nd century. His wife, as great, but for the limitation of ordination to males back then, would have been one of the leading rabbis of the era. Her name was Beruria. It was the Sabbath, it was the afternoon of the Sabbath, the rabbi was out, he was probably teaching. A terrible tragedy befell the household. Beruria found her 2 sons had both died. She laid their bodies on the bed in the bedroom and closed the door. When the Sabbath ended, she turned to Meir, her husband, and says, "I have a question. I'm asking you this question as my rabbi. I received 2 very precious gifts on loan, and the lender has just announced that it's time to return the gifts, and I'm not ready to return them. What shall I do?" And the mayor said, "Beloved wife, surely you know the answer already. I don't know why you're asking me. You must return the gifts." And so she said, "Well, come have a look." And she shows him the terrible reality, and they grieve together. So, is your life alone? Is the meaning of your life to be found in the context of a framework of reality that's larger than the naked fact of your existence. If we are bound to seek meaningful lives rather than just lives that start here and end there, is that meaning to be found with reference to a framework which is not limited? Our lives are limited. Their meaning is found in connection with that which is unlimited. That's a rabbinic echo of the song that we just heard as well. I invite you to think along those lines. Now, who'd like to be the brave person to take the first step into the yet undivided waters of the Red Sea? When you step in and go up to your neck, that's when the waters are going to divide.
Would you repeat that last thing you said, though?
About the meaning of life?
Yeah.
You got to climb Mount Everest, and you got to see the guru there, and he'll tell you what the meaning of life is. No, that's not what I said. What I said is that thanks to Descartes, we know that we are. And thanks to Moses, the man of God, we know that we are but for a little while. We exist, we are finite. We are DNA, which is dust, and we are dreams. That's who we are, dust and dreams, DNA and dreams. But in the dreaming part of ourselves, we have a connection, we sense a connection, we insist on a connection to that which is deathless, that which is transcendent. Not us, but God. God is not us, but God is in relation with us. We are in relation with God. We, the finite, are in relation with the Ein Sof, the infinite. And that's a vital part of who we are. I would submit that the whole approach to living and dying, which needs to be a holistic approach, ought to be framed by that consciousness. That's the point I'm suggesting. Please, Emily. By the way, if you can't hear Emily, I will restate what she says. Not that she doesn't have a good loud voice, but...
Well, I'm 82.75. I had to write that down yesterday. And I am a walking time bomb. So I face my own mortality, and I have also lost a child. Your example really touched me. Been there, done that.
In the beginning of Hamlet, Claudius, who's not the nicest guy, as we know, tries to console Prince Hamlet by saying that, why wear him all to black all the time? You know, your father lost a father, and that father lost his, and that's the way it is. And that is the way it is. And when it's not the way it is, when we lose a child, that's a unique tragedy. You're right?
I have a question.
Harry.
How do you think, because we are gods and we are alone, how should we go gently into the dark night, or should we not?
Could you read a little more of the poem so that we...
This is written by Dylan Thomas, and he's talking to his father dying, and he says... Anyway, this is written by Dylan Thomas in 1937, and he basically tells his father, do not go gentle in that good night, like fight. But if we're gods, should we fight, or how much should we fight?
What do you think? Is there one size fits all? Francis?
I have been told that we die how we live.
We die how we live. If we live feisty, we die feisty.
Yes.
If we live complaisant, we die complaisant. That may well be. That may well be. Although in Bertolt Brecht's short story, Die Alte Greisen, I never read it in English, so I think it means the little old lady. Die Alte Greisen. It's a real short story. It's about this sweet little bubby who was a housefrau, and up until age 72, she did nothing that you wouldn't expect a proper housefrau to do, and then she was widowed, and for the last 2 years of her life, she cut loose and was finally the person that the repressed herself had never been. So I agree with you, we die the way we live, but remember that we always live with something less than 100% of our potential fulfilled. There's always the opportunity to fulfill the as yet unfulfilled potential. Sir?
actually lost both of my grandfathers before reaching adulthood. Thing is that my maternal grandfather was a very successful physician and had a big house and a nice car. And my grandpa was a successful engineer, big house, nice car. But the thing is that my grandpa died a few days after choking on a fancy meal, and my other grandpa just his brain just gave up on him over the course of like, I don't know, 2 years, year and a half, I guess. So I guess I can't help but wonder, what's the point of, I don't want to say that what's the point of doing anything, that's not at all what I'm saying, but what's the point of, I don't know. I guess I just don't want to do that. Like, whenever I think about what I want to do, I always think about what I leave behind, like, what people remember me for, what I've done for.
You asked one of the key questions that people need to ask if they're going to be sentient and fully human. I know that as
So
far as,
basically, what's the point of,
right, what's the point of it since it's finite?
like, what, if I can't take any of that with me, so.
Right.
And is that all there is?
Like,
We get this question all the time. And there's more than one good answer, and we may each have a chance. Let me answer the point you raised. Do you like music?
yeah.
Tell me your favorite piece of music.
Oh, I don't know, but,
Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
no.
No.
How about,
Witchy Woman by the
actually, no, it's Island in the Sun by Weezer, okay?
Island in the Sun. It's a song.
By Weezer.
Yeah, it's about 3 minutes.
I don't know.
More. The typical song is 3 minutes. Let's say it's 4. Okay. Is it any less precious because it ends?
No. But what about,
Sue or Win?
but I like it because it makes, but what I like about it is not that it's somehow, it makes me feel better than just,
Yeah, it works on your soul.
yeah.
We can work on each other's souls, even if we're only here 70 or 80 years or less.
The thing is that, what I mean is that I've often just fantasized about becoming what's called a wandering ascetic or a mending kid, just abandoning all sort of material comforts just to live for what's really important for others.
There are different paths to service, and that is one path that is uniquely right for some people, and other paths are right for other people. So it's not as if here too, it's one size fits all. But what is the common denominator is that I want to submit to you. The meaning of your life is not found in anything narcissistic. If it's only about that good meal, you'll be so disappointed when you realize it's coming to an end. If it's about others, then life goes on and you're part of that which is going on.
Well, they were very good men, and they...
So that means they touched the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I love teachers so much, because they touch tomorrow. Win or Sue?
So I guess I just wanted, I mentioned the sexism because I didn't see the point of, not sure I see the point of any material comforts at all, since I can't take anything with me at all.
I've noticed something, and I was also on the oncology unit in 2015. I got cancer in 2013, and I had a really bad case of pneumonia and almost died on the oncology unit, where they really treat you well too. I really recommend that unit from the nurses. But anyway, I've noticed something about how a person's perspective changes when they know when they get the diagnosis that of a terminal illness or one that can't be cured but that can just be managed. And that is their life often seems to take on more meaning. And I have a dear friend who found out he had cancer, and something has happened to him. It's like mantle has been taken off of him, or a shroud or something, and he's really much more happy. And I think it's because, I wonder if it's because he knows that life is going to end now. He knows for sure his death, his mortality, and so he's cut loose. It's really quite amazing, and I've seen that with other people too. And I think that one of the things about living with mortality means different things for the first half and the second half of life. Because in the first half, you really have to develop your ego. You really have to get your place in the world and establish yourself. But then, and you count your years by how long you've been here from your birth. I'm 30, I'm 40, you know. But then in the second half of life, which comes anywhere from 35 to about 50, maybe later for some, is that you count your days by how much you have left. So it's a very different kind of attitude, I think, that you have. And something that I read this morning during morning prayer had to do with poverty of spirit. I think that as you get older, in the second half of life, often you develop the first beatitude of poverty of spirit, in that you become not so full of yourself and are able to be receptive and loving to others and more giving in some way. Some people started right away from the beginning, but for a lot of us it takes them a while. But I think it's that poverty of spirit that, well, here I am. And the material things fall away, and it's the relationships. And somehow, something happens when, maybe Carrie knows about this in learning theory, when you come up to the end of the course, they say like the last 6 weeks people learn more in research that they've done. So when you're coming up at the end of your course of life, I think there's more learning.
Margaret, in just a minute, but let's go back for a second to Carrie's question. Is do not go gently an advice to be heeded, or does it depend on who you are? We can say that people's personalities continue to be manifest in their final steps of the journey, and that's certainly true. But could we also say that there are some common features about being at the end of the journey that bind folks together? We're hearing now, we just heard from Mother Sue that one of those features is that you have the possibility of not sweating the little stuff. Right? So are there common requests of those who, if I can use the expression, are actively dying? Now, it's one thing to say theoretically we're all dying because each day in a finite series is one day closer to the end of the series. That's true, of course. But when you know, I'm not going to see the trees flower again. This is the last time I'm going to see that beautiful sight as I look out the window right here on our courtyard. And so it means something else to you, precisely because it's finite. So are there characteristic requests to be with family, to say words of forgiveness, to say words of apology, to say words of love, to be at home, right? Or if perhaps it's a bucket list, right? When Irma Bombeck, the great humorist, read her book about her final steps of the journey, she said, "I want to see Boise," which is very funny. So it's like saying, I want to see Pungo. I invite you to think beyond the vagaries of individual personality. There are certain things that we share just because we're human. And when we are fellow humans at the end of the stage, we may have certain characteristic requests. And then, if you'll remember last week's conversation, we as the community, which includes, as Moses said to Pharaoh, we walk with old and young together. That's how we get out of Egypt, old and young together. So if we are a community and we have in our midst those who are actively dying and they have characteristic requests, how can we respond to those needs in a way which makes the presence of God more meaningful for all of us? So we should be thinking about that as well. Margaret, you were going to say something.
I'm tagging on what Mother Sue said. I think in the first half of life, we have everything to gain. Whereas in the second half of life, we have nothing to lose. And so why not? And I thought about both of my parents, one of whom lived fearfully of the what ifs. If I do this, then that could happen. And the other was, why ever not? And let's go laughing and...
Right. I mean, what if I should lose my social standing? What if I don't get invited to the next art opening? As opposed to, when I'm old, I shall wear purple.
Yes.
Is that one of the poems you gave us?
No, I don't know.
When I'm old, I shall wear purple.
I did a lot of purple.
The other poem that Carrie and I were thinking about this before the session, we both recommend to you Dylan Thomas's poem, Fern Hill, about a little boy who first becomes aware that people die. In my own theology, this is the meaning of eating the fruit of knowledge. That the human doesn't live only in the now. The human is aware of time as a continuum in which I'm going to die. And that's, in my understanding, what it is to have eaten that fruit. And in Dylan Thomas's poem, it ends, he says, though I sang in my chains like the sea. You know that you're chained, but can you still sing like the sea? Sir?
Hi. Kind of on your point, I know like, when I think of mortality, I think like heaven, hell, purgatory as well. Like there's some traditional understanding of like you go to a different place and you die. Seems to kind of like limit like my understanding of mortality. Seems to make it more like fearful than like thinking about like life after death. Really. So like, in what ways do those traditional understandings of eternity help us, and in which ways do we move past those?
You didn't read the 4th chapter of my PhD dissertation. Because it was just on that. Each of us would have a good answer and a different answer, and I'm sensitive to time. I'm going to give you a real fast answer, and it's not the only thing to be said. The where am I going to go, the real estate focused approach. Remember the game of life with the spinner and the little car? I want to go to millionaire estates. I don't want to go to the poor house. Remember that? Since I'm from New Jersey, I want to get the box seats in the Meadowlands Stadium. I don't want to be out where Jimmy Hoffa's buried. That geographical real estate focus just never works for me. I much prefer to think, not where am I going, but to whom am I going? If I think that God is infinite, and I'm no longer in the field of time, am I able to feel in some sense that one separation from God is falling away? For me, that's been a great consolation. When I recite the memorial prayer in the Jewish funeral service, there's one phrase in the Hebrew which I retranslate. May God of compassion, you who dwell on high, may you grant perfect rest in the shelter of your divine presence to the soul of so-and-so, child of so-and-so, asher halach le'olamo, who has gone to his world, or to her world. Well, whose world? Is it God's world? Is it the person's true world? So I've retranslated that. I say, dear God, please grant perfect peace in the shelter of your presence to the soul of whom you have summoned to eternity. That's the way I see it. We are summoned to eternity. And it's consoling to me because I think of who is summoning me. So that's my answer. Other answers?
Troy, this isn't exactly for what you were, but when you were talking about the material things, I have struggled with that too. And the reason I think I'm not a mendicant beggar or walking around, the reason I think material things can be important is because you are in a better position to help other people. Like Jim Bickford, he can do all the wonderful things he does because he can pay the homeless people to paint. So that's one reason why, if you want to sell everything and go off, that's fine, but material things really can help you help other people. The second thing, I'm so sorry about your losing your child. And this gets me is that a couple of the poems I printed out. It's hard for me to think when I pass away that people are going to move on. I want the world to stop. You know, I'm like, okay, if I'm not here, even when I travel, I don't want anything to happen when I'm gone. But we have to move on. And as you know, you have to move on. You can mourn for a while, but you have to move on, which is kind of scary for me because does anybody even remember who I am? But like you said, you still remember your child. And the third thing, and I think I'm not quite facing my mortality yet, but is I have had my father die, my uncle die, my grandparents, my pets, and it's just, when I watch people I love get older and die, I don't know how hard I should hold on to them. Like, stay, even though you're in a coma or and you're in intense pain, how much should we hold?
Please do not do that to me.
My mom has already told me that I'm not allowed to have anything because I would keep her forever, like frozen forever. So, but that's the hard thing for me to know how much to push people.
Letting go. Letting go is letting go is the mantra for the second half of life. Yes.
I've been sitting there listening to these wonderful stories and thinking my mind is going all over the place. But one of the great privileges of being a priest for so many years is having taken this journey with people for so many years. And there are some themes that I see. One has been kind of touched upon, but there is a freedom to love unabashedly. A freedom to love unabashedly. Sue and I are ministering to a couple who have been together for 30 years. She is dying actively. He is caring for her. And it is exquisite to see the care that he is doing for her. And I've seen that over and over again. And to love unabashedly. And I found that when I was ill in '99, you know, that there were some incredibly beautiful moments there. So there is something that is of the eternal in those moments. The second is my mother, who is 95, about to turn 95, and I'm just really learning to love and appreciate her. She drove me nuts most of my life. But the great moment was when she was in her late 80s. She had very serious urine cancer, and finally she went through this whole surgery and recovery and all of that stuff. She got into the car after seeing the surgeon for the last time, and she said to me, well, I asked him if now I could have sex again. And after I thought, wow, too much information. I thought, by golly, she's going to live until she dies. And so there is something about that. And finally, our former associate, Ann Brower, when she was dying, Ann Brower was about 6'2", with a deep voice, those of us who knew her, and she developed a very serious cancer. She was a world famous radiologist, bone radiologist. And she could intimidate you. She yelled at a parishioner one time, and the parishioner came back a few hours later with a button that says, "Don't yell at me, I'm a volunteer." But when she was dying, she had a party every night. She decided that she was going to have fun. She got a scooter. She had a couple of turnovers in the scooter, but she had a party every night. And her dying process was more fun for all of us. I mean, not that we wanted to see her go, but that she knew she loved to celebrate, and so she did that. So that taught me a lot about the wisdom of dying, that there is a way in which it teaches us to love, but also to savor life and to be authentically ourselves, as my mother was able to break out of all those constrictions of her generation.
My life, the things I've done have allowed me to spend a lot of time with dying through the years, many people. But when it comes to yourself and your spouse, it's different. And Bo and I were in a bad accident a few years ago, and the van turned over in a creek in Colorado, and everybody couldn't see anything. And I looked up and saw Bo underwater, and all this blood on his back, and I thought he was dead. So I was yelling at people to, go get Bo out, and people weren't able, they were shocked. But anyway, so then I just climbed through, and pulled him out, and he wasn't dead. But what he told, and this is such a different response for us, because what he told me, I said, "What were you thinking?" He said, "Well, I couldn't free myself. I couldn't breathe, so I thought, this is how I'm going to die. I wonder what it's going to be like." And for me, now this wasn't my death, but somebody else's, it was Katie barred the door. I was going after it, I wasn't going to let him die as if I could really have anything to do with it, but it was two totally, now that's sudden death and not the death that we've been talking about, but sometimes death is sudden, and you see what your patterns are, and I thought, oh my God, Bo's so calm and relaxed, and me, I'm going out, just fighting. I don't know when the time comes, but, every decade changes.
You may know the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on stages of our coming to grips with our mortality. And the final one of those stages she characterizes as acceptance. There's a hilarious Simpsons episode where someone goes through the 5 stages in about 5 seconds. Will?
I don't know that I have a whole lot to contribute on the subject of mortality, partly because at my stage of life, I think just naturally, I don't ponder it often. Perhaps I should. Perhaps it would be a healthier thing. But one thing that has been very transformative for me in terms of how my own mortality affects what happens now is a theological concept of the new heaven and new earth. That whatever that means theologically, scripturally, if there is a sense in which we may have some embodied reality in the future, after this life. There may be, there may not be, I don't know. But if there is, could there be a sense in which the things that I'm a part of and do in my life now contribute to and carry over to whatever that other life may be? And if so, it would seem that those things would have a lot to do with the things that we've discussed in this wisdom tradition that Jesus himself lived out. And so whether it's joy and celebration or love and service or whatever those things are, those are the things that I find myself now giving more of my life to. So that whatever happens post-death, whatever happens in some other life that may exist, whatever that looks like, it's given me a new focus on how I do what I do now. Just thinking in terms of potential embodied reality in the life of God at some point in the future.
This gives me a segue to the ethics of the fathers. Rabbi Jacob says, better one moment of heavenly reward than all the blissful actions of this world, but better one moment of living out a life of love and kindness in this world than all the bliss of the world to come. We're aware that we're in a provisional, a temporary, a world which is only but so good. It is good, but it's only but so good. So we envision what is better. And yet, this codependent, finite, incredibly beautiful life is where we are doing it now. So what I would say is all the hopes for a better future are totally in place, totally. But let's not forget the task of repairing the world right here and now. We're just about at the end of time. I want to share one last vignette that a rabbi colleague of mine taught me. His name is Elliot Marmon. You might remember him. He served in the Virginia Beach congregation about 20 years ago. And he came to a rabbi's meeting and told us the following story. His dad was dying, and he, Rabbi Marmon himself, was just back from service overseas. He was local. He wanted to help his father. He drove up to Philadelphia to have the talk, right, about preparing for eternity. And his dad was a very big Philadelphia baseball fan and had the game on. Elliot wants to talk to his dad. And his dad is polite, but really wants to watch the game. And Elliot persists. And finally his dad says, "Hey, you want to watch the game or what?" And the point of that story is that it's not for us to tell the dying when they should let go of simple joys. I've been to a nursing home where a misguided staff member doesn't want grandma to start dinner with her chocolate cake. She's 99. Let her start. Are we worried that 20 years hence she's going to get diabetes? Let her have a chocolate cake. Savor the moment. Remember it's only a moment. Remember that God is forever.